Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is The Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Coming up, the nanny state says you're no longer allowed to talk to your neighbors. Justin Trudeau exposes his hypocrisy, and business owners are left in the lurch.
The Andrew Lawton Show starts right now.
They're on to us. I know the last couple of weeks I've been talking about this growing divide between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law, and now the law enforcement community has caught up with us. They're going after, according to Ottawa, loopholes. They don't want people to exploit the physical distancing loopholes that are pretty much what most people would call sensible behavior. This is a story in the Ottawa Citizen that's going viral for all the wrong reasons. An Ottawa health official, the Associate Medical Officer of Health, has a message for you. If you have been enjoying a beer on your driveway with a friend or exchanging pleasantries with a neighbor over the garden fence, stop it. Now, this is the Ottawa Citizen's paraphrase of a message from Dr. Brent Maloney. He says, "We are hearing about people who are looking for what I call loopholes. The problem is that a gathering can start with two people on a driveway or talking over the fence and turn into a parking lot or backyard party," he said. You know, he's actually right. You know, I was having a conversation with my wife on the couch the other day. We were sitting a couple of meters apart, and before you knew it, we had a whole go-go party in. We had 50 people over. We had the barbecue firing up. We had pina coladas being made. The blender was whirring, all because we started off just the two of us talking. You know, that is actually a gateway drug to the bigger things like giant block parties, like giant beachside orgies, whatever you want. A conversation over the fence with your neighbor. Like, what was it, Wilson in Home Improvement? I know Wilson was the volleyball in Castaway. I don't know if Wilson was the guy on the other side of the fence. That's no more. That's a loophole. You can't do it. This is laughable and insane, and I think that people are justifiably mocking it here. Police and law enforcement need to go after those who are breaking the law in a way that is causing there to be a risk to someone else. If there is a block party, great, go after it. If people are having a mass congregation event, great, go after it. But if you've got a couple of people that are talking over the fence, who cares? You know what? If a bylaw officer goes in there, he has got a joylessness problem, or she has got a joylessness problem that is worse than I think anything coronavirus is going to do in that situation. You know, I feel like every episode of the show now is just going to be talking about something that we've learned is now illegal. Last time, it was rollerblading in Oakville. A week ago, it was sitting on the empty beach. It was playing in a park with your 4-year-old son a week before that, or a day before that. And now it is talking over the fence in Ottawa. Now, Ottawa has been, it sounds like, the epicenter, not of the virus, but the epicenter of the nanny state nonsense that is the government overreaction to the virus at the expense of civil liberties. For whatever reason, Ottawa has just taken this with gusto, and now they're actually going after people who decide they want to sit on their driveway and yell at their neighbor who's also sitting on their driveway because, oh, that's a loophole, and you can't do that. Give me a break. So on the weekend, my wife and I had driven somewhere for essential business. We went somewhere for essential reasons, I promise. And on the way back, we wanted to pick up a jigsaw puzzle from my parents. Now, I know this sounds like a horrendously ridiculous existence that we have. This is what lockdown has done to us. And the reason is because you can't get an Amazon puzzle anymore. You can't get a puzzle from Toys R Us. In all honesty, if you haven't tried, try. You cannot get a jigsaw puzzle from any online retailer. Now, my parents, over the years, I have gifted them a number of jigsaw puzzles, so I knew they had an inventory. We were going to be passing by their house anyway. I said, okay, can we do like a dead drop on their driveway for the jigsaw puzzle? And, you know, they basically put it there, and we can go up and sanitize it and spray it away and, you know, look around, and then it'll be under the park bench or something. You know, like, this is what we had to do, the dead drop for the jigsaw puzzle. And as it so happened, they brought the puzzle out and, we did the whole thing, cleaned it off and all that. And the thing that I found fascinating is that I ended up having a conversation with a couple of people that I haven't seen in quite a while from opposite ends of the driveway. Now, was this a loophole? Sure. But at the same time, no one was harmed. No one was threatened. No Lawtons were killed in the making of this conversation. So the fact that this would be a target for the Ottawa Bylaw Office or the Ottawa Public Health Office or any municipality's police department is actually quite an offensive concept, because when you start policing ordinary everyday activities that people are doing with the accommodations for coronavirus and COVID-19, you're going far beyond the point at which people should be or can be comfortable with this. So in the Ottawa case, the advice itself is the same. Stay home, only make essential trips, associate only with people in your household. Well, associating with is a tricky term because, if you are talking to someone over the backyard fence, you're talking to someone in the next driveway over, I don't think if you are being cautious and careful, anyone, certainly not a government bureaucrat, has a right to tell you no. And this is not on my part about minimizing COVID-19, not at all. In fact, I've been taking this very seriously. I've been doing my due diligence as a citizen, as a law-abiding citizen, and as someone who takes public health very seriously. But you can't surrender civil liberties for public health when it's not even like the act that the government is trying to crack down on will have an impact at all on public health. Now, there have been a couple of examples of this that, like I said, I'll probably mention each episode because I want to remind people how close we are to losing a lot of these things that we've all taken for granted. There was a tweet from Raleigh Police in North Carolina that, again, I don't even think the police were in the wrong, but it does come across as just having that eeriness and ickiness. Because in Raleigh, North Carolina, there were a bunch of people protesting the government's lockdown order. And of course, because they're protesting the lockdown order, they are not themselves locked down. And police posted a picture. They said the protesters are in violation of the governor's executive order and have been asked to leave. Someone asks what part of the governor's order was violated here, and a little bit cheekily, Raleigh Police says protesting is a non-essential activity. So it's very circular. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you protest the fact that you're not allowed to do non-essential things, that protest gets deemed a non-essential activity, and then boom, no protest. I mean, why doesn't government do this more often? Anytime you do something that says the government is wrong, you're deemed a non-essential activity. And of course, as I mentioned before, Americans are a lot more prone to standing up against this stuff because Americans would hear this and say, but the First Amendment, and they'd probably yell it and say it a lot less kindly. I have a friend of mine who's a blogger, Kathy Shadle, and she had said anyone who thinks that people won't go along with this long term has never been to an airport in the last 20 years. And see, that actually differs from my thesis, because my thesis was that people won't really buy into all of this, and people will get very tired of it. And her thing is that everyone just goes along with it like they have with all of the ridiculous airport security, quote-unquote, enhancements post 9/11. So we'll see who's right and who's wrong. I hope that we don't have to do this long enough that any one of us has to be right or wrong about this, but this is what's happening here. And the most chilling police tweet of the week is not the Raleigh, North Carolina police, but the Central Community Team from Central Bedfordshire in England. Now, the Central Bedfordshire people have said, if you think that by going for a picnic in a rural location, no one will find you, don't be surprised if an officer appears from the shadows. We are covering the whole country. Now, the picture accompanying that tweet, 2 officers in shadow telling people just because you go for a picnic in a rural location doesn't mean we won't find you. Don't be surprised. We'll sneak up on you. We'll be there. You'll be doing a picnic alone. You won't be near anyone. You won't be breaking the rules. You won't be harming anyone or yourselves. And we're going to sneak up on you from the bushes and tell you, you're busted now. And again, Who is more harmed? The person minding their own business, having a picnic out in the middle of nowhere, or the person who is approached in the middle of nowhere by two police, all of a sudden doubling the number of people that are in this confined space, all in the name of enforcing physical distance. And to enforce physical distance, we're going to have law enforcement close in on you, because this is exactly where we are in society right now. And I said last week that there were really huge imbalances in the way the UK police, which have turned a blind eye in the past to just absolutely heinous crimes, decide they're going to go all in on enforcing COVID-19. There are a lot of people that it seems like absolutely love the world we're in now. The people that absolutely seem to love this idea that they have purpose in their lives because they can now go and tell people, oh, you can't have a picnic, you can't talk to your neighbor, you can't go ride a bike, you can't go fishing, you can't do all of these things. And there are entire industries that I think are basing themselves off of this now. The bylaw enforcement industry, for example, which is, I think, probably one of the only industries that's doing better off in the midst of the economic turndown right now than anything else, is the bylaw enforcement, law enforcement. I mean, you get a lot of these bylaw enforcement officers that I'm pretty sure think they're like the modern-day Rambos. I mean, it's not even like I'm going to give them credit for being on the front lines like I will police or paramedics or hospital workers. It's like bylaw enforcement officers, I feel like we could have so far from the front lines there in Switzerland during this battle, and the country would be better off, not worse off. But I also kind of think that year-round about bylaw enforcement, so I'm a bad person to talk to about that. However, we have this story in Blacklock's Reporter that is talking about the fact that under the new legislation passed by the federal government, anyone who crosses the border illegally or unlawfully for non-essential cross-border travel. So it doesn't mean you've crossed illegally because you're an illegal immigrant. It means if you cross because you want to visit grandma rather than delivering a load of papayas or something to the local grocery store, they're going to ticket children $100. So the new regulations passed by Cabinet are that non-essential border travelers who are apparently able to cross the border will be fined $1,000 for illegal entry into Canada, $750 for failure to comply with an order, $275 for providing a false or misleading statement, and $100 for any minors. Now, I'm assuming they give that bill to the parents. Dr. Howard New, who is the Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, says that those who arrive in Canada must have an adequate plan. And these rules, by the way, are also impacting those who break the Quarantine Act when they come in, although that actually could have a much steeper fine. If you come in and you break the quarantine orders, you could be fined, I think it was up to $1 million in some terms, although it doesn't look like they've invoked that part of it right now. But they have changed and amended the Quarantine Act. And again, it still is very lacking in enforcement. You get people that come into the country, and yes, the government says you must quarantine yourself for 14 days, but they have no follow-up mechanism. They have no enforcement potential. And the fact that there are people that are talking about these sorts of snitch lines and stuff, I think is dangerous. But I also think that if you're going to have a rule, you have to enforce it when there is a public safety risk only. And that's the line here, because on some areas, I'm like, yeah, enforce the law. Enforce the law as much as you can. Enforce it because it's a public safety issue. Then there are other laws that I'm like, why on earth are we enforcing these ones and not the other ones? You look at before the government decided it was going to turn away illegal border crossers. My thought would be, why are we enforcing all of these ridiculous ordinances like skateboarding parks that are closed that someone skateboards on? But for a time, anyone could just waltz into Canada via Roxham Road, and the government would still say, oh, welcome to Canada. We'll put you on the waiting list. We'll set you up at an apartment. Welcome. This is your new home now for the next couple of years before we forget that we were supposed to deport you. So that's where the imbalance is here. It's that the laws that are being enforced, the things that the government is caring about, it seems like are a lot less significant than the things they aren't caring about. And this misguided priority set is permeating through every single level, I think, of this process. And I have to talk about Easter weekend here because this is something everyone's been asking me about. And I didn't talk about it on my show on Monday because I hadn't yet heard Justin Trudeau's response. And I wanted to wait a couple of days to hear what he was going to say and then delve into it and talk about all the other stuff here. And it's that Justin Trudeau decided he would break what he had been telling all Canadians to do for weeks by having Easter with his family in Harrington Lake. Now, you all saw that Instagram post from Sophie Gregoire Trudeau. Sophie, Justin, the three kids, all hamming it up and having a little outdoor Easter celebration at Harrington Lake, which is the Prime Minister's country residence, which is 30 minutes from... Actually, I don't even think it's 30 minutes. It's 30 kilometers from where the Prime Minister officially lives. And I think we need to have a longer-term discussion after this about official residences, and perhaps if the Prime Minister needs two residences, they don't need to be so close that it could just be benefited by one. But again, long-standing grief, nothing to do with coronavirus. So for whatever reason, 3 weeks ago, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, after getting cleared of coronavirus, had moved with the Trudeau children to Harrington Lake. Trudeau made that decision. I have no idea why. I don't particularly care why. But the arrangement, as we understand it for the last few weeks, was that Trudeau is at Rideau Cottage and Harrington Lake is occupied by the rest of the family. And there was that weird sort of, Justin Trudeau was in quarantine, but he was still, after the 14 days was up, decided he would stay for 40 days and 40 nights or something, whatever it was. And then on Friday, I think it was, he was asked, what are you going to do for Easter? Which was, a really hard-hitting question from the mainstream media, as always. And he said, I'm hoping to see my family. Now, this was just 1 hour, I think, before Howard New had said, who's the Deputy Public Health Advisor to Canada, had said, you know what, you're going to have that big family dinner on Skype, and you're going to have virtual Easter dinners and all of that. And Trudeau just said, I'm going to see my family. Now, there were a lot of people that kind of defended him, that were really parsing that and saying, he means FaceTiming them or something like that. And I didn't really think anything of it because I don't really care what most people do on Easter weekend. And then the picture comes, and it's like, well, hang on. So right now, non-essential travel is banned in general. Quebec has secured its border so that you can't actually do non-essential travel from Ontario to Quebec. You have to get stopped and questioned, and you have to answer what it is that you're planning on doing in Quebec. And then you have the fact that Trudeau and his family, by their own admission, are living at two separate addresses right now. And again, why they made that decision, I don't know or care about, but they decided, and they were going to live at the two separate addresses. So then Trudeau decides he's going to go to Harrington Lake, cross a provincial boundary. My colleague Candace Malcolm did a video talking about all of the specific rules that Trudeau did break. And I want to make it very clear here that I don't care, were it not for how clear he was that this is not allowed for other people. And it was interesting how much pushback there was when people on Twitter were raising these questions, and then the mainstream media started to ask it, and all of a sudden now it's fine. And now it's commendable to ask these questions. But you had stories in Global, the National Post, etc. And I want to read the one from Global here, which I think is interesting. Trudeau under fire for Easter trip despite urging Canadians to, quote, sacrifice plans. And they mention, I think, this very important line that Trudeau gave on the weekend before his Easter dinner with the family.
You'll have to stay home. You'll have to Skype that big family dinner. And the Easter egg hunt, well, it'll have to happen around the house instead of around the neighborhood.
So he says stay home and Skype the family dinner, and then he decides to just get in the car and head on across the Ottawa River not long after. But where I find it interesting is that when asked about it, he just said, we continue to follow all the instructions from public health authorities. The follow-up question was asked by the journalist in French, did somebody tell you this was okay? And he says, yep, my family's been living there for 3 weeks, and this is where my wife and children live. So he doesn't actually say how what he did squares with the public advice, the public health advice that he's been parroting and that his public health team has been parroting. And this is, I think, the best part, and this is why I wanted to cite that Global story. At the bottom of it, speaking on background, a government official said the Prime Minister should be considered an essential worker and therefore allowed to cross the border into Quebec. Now, I will not comment on whether Justin Trudeau is deemed an essential worker. I think most of the time it might be a very difficult sell to make that case. I guess I did comment on it. All right, well, anyway. But even if he is an essential worker, which if you can say that with a straight face, then good on you, he should be allowed to cross the border into Quebec. And the other line, the official also suggested the travel should be viewed as the Prime Minister traveling between his work location and a new primary residence for his family. Now, these words do not appear anywhere else. They are made up for the purposes of justifying what Trudeau has done, traveling between his work location and a new primary residence for his family. Well, his new family primary residence is different than his primary residence, which is different than where he works because he works at the one primary residence. So the government has been specifically telling people not to go to their cottage. Harrington Lake is best described as the Justin Trudeau cottage, as the Prime Minister of Canada's cottage. And now the big line is, I don't know, he's just traveling from one residence to the other. So again, the rules for me are different than the rules for thee. That's the big theme here. And I can't stress enough that I wouldn't care if we were not having Canadians being told, don't talk to your neighbor who's in the driveway over, don't rollerblade at the empty park, don't go to the cottage. If we were not being told all of these things, I wouldn't care. But it's that there is a double standard. And Justin Trudeau has made a priority about being the model of good behavior. And that was why he stayed in his 14-day quarantine for the better part of, I think, 27 years or something. It just never ended. It kept going. The reason he did that was because he was saying, listen, I'm following all the rules. I'm following all the health advice. And then the second it's no longer convenient to do so, he's zoomed across the provincial border, and then he's back in time for the next press conference from Rideau Cottage. And that is the very definition of hypocrisy. And by the way, I don't think it is all that similar to what happened with Andrew Scheer, which, well, the timing was terrible, and I realized that. I think the two were different cases, because Andrew Scheer, who has had to conduct matters of being the official opposition leader, so much so that the government arranged for a government jet to bring Andrew Scheer to Ottawa for the first parliamentary session, and then I think for the second as well. Andrew Scheer has done this thing that he's had to do because it's important to have opposition leaders as part of the process. He lives in Regina. You can't get from Regina to Ottawa by car without just a miserable drive that I don't think anyone wants to do. So the Trudeau government, the Prime Minister's office, offers a government jet. It's picking up Elizabeth May. It's picking up Carla Qualtrough. It's picking up Andrew Scheer. There's room on the plane. Andrew Scheer decides, okay, we're going to move the family to Ottawa and stay there so I don't have to do this back and forth. There's room on the plane for the family. They ask the Prime Minister's office. They say, yeah, that's fine. Bring your family. They ask Elizabeth May. Elizabeth May says, yeah, that's fine. They ask Carla Qualtrough. She says, yeah, that's fine. And no one has any issues. They all get on the mask. They use their hand sanitizer. They use all the things they're supposed to do. They land. Everything's fine. Scheer's back in Ottawa. May's back in Ottawa. Qualtrough's back in Ottawa. And then Elizabeth May just decides she's going to just go and, if I can use the term, just start bitching to CBC about, oh my goodness, Andrew Scheer, and we didn't like this, and we were all stacked on top of each other, and we weren't socially distanced, and just shut up. I mean, for crying out loud, if you had a problem with it, you were literally asked, you could have said no. She made this big show about, the generosity. She said she was overcome by generosity at the time, and so much so that it had an expiration date on it. She couldn't maintain that level of generosity a second longer than the flight, apparently. And then she starts complaining, and then the CBC story runs this thing about Andrew Scheer and the Challenger jet. He's fielding 8 questions from reporters at his press conference on Tuesday morning, whereas Trudeau's little Easter getaway on Tuesday gets him 1 question and 1 follow-up from just one reporter. Now, if I had my druthers, I'd say we talk about neither. I'd say we talk about neither, because you have people that are business owners that are suffering. You have people that are in families that can't afford to pay their bills. You have people that have no idea whether they will have a job or what their life will look like in 2 weeks, let alone in 2 months, let alone in a year. So I don't actually care that much about where the Prime Minister spends his Easter or about whether Andrew Scheer decides to live in Regina or in Ottawa for the duration of this crisis. But if you are going to go down that road of caring about these things, you're going to choose to make these the hills to die on, my goodness, media, can you be a bit more bloody consistent? You disgusting hacks who just will take two situations that have that common thread and completely turn a blind eye to what Justin Trudeau does. But when Andrew Scheer does it, he's a conservative. So we're going to berate and badger and go and keep hammering and keep hammering and keep hammering to such a point that you don't even know what you're even talking about anymore. But he's the bad guy and Justin Trudeau's the good guy. You know, I talk a lot about media bias because it's there for a reason, and that discussion is an important one. But for the most part, I actually have a lot of respect for the people that I've encountered in my career working in media. There are a few people that really stand out as being exceptionally bad, and there are a few people that I have no opinion on. But it was just such an embarrassing display when I saw, and by the way, I was at that, or by electronic means, I was on the phone for that press conference, and I was hearing this, and I didn't see it in real time, and I didn't see that Andrew Scheer had actually shaken his head at one point because the question was just so ridiculous. And she asked, listen, why are the rules there for other people and not for you? No one asked Trudeau that. Even the one question that Trudeau did field, I think it was from Le Devoir, was a question that was a lot more on line with, just tell us about why you did it. Tell us what you were thinking. Whereas with Scheer, it was, why did you do this? How dare you do this? And look, politicians need to be held to account at all parties. And if you think this is a partisan thing, just look at stuff I've said about Andrew Scheer in the past. I have not held back when the Conservatives and when Andrew Scheer have warranted criticism. This is not one of these situations. And my goodness, if we are going to choose to fight to the death on these things, we're going to see a lot more cases like the Ottawa health officials saying, don't talk to your neighbors in the driveway. We'll become the Stepford country before you know it, where everyone just has this robotic, automatronic means of going through life, and nothing will ever get accomplished. And I don't even think the public health crisis will be cleared because no one will be on that track. We'll just be thinking of enforcement and enforcement only. And we will all suffer as Canadians. And you look at, in Scotland, by the way, the chief medical officer resigned after what was heralded as being conflicting in messages. She was telling everyone to stay put. This is Dr. Catherine Calderwood. And then she ended up resigning because she had been traveling to her second home on weekends. So she actually resigned. And this was something that, again, I want to stress. I'm not choosing to make the Trudeau thing the big fight. But Corey Morgan had said on Twitter, this person lost her job for doing exactly what Justin Trudeau did last weekend. He says, I guess Scotland has a lower tolerance of gross hypocrisy than Canada does. So she apologizes profusely because she's been telling everyone stay put, and then on weekends saying, I'm going to go to my cottage. I'm going to go to my other house. So, yeah, politicians need to be leaders. They need to be role models. I get it. But at the same time, do we really want to adopt a snitch culture and make that the cornerstone of this country? We certainly don't, because it won't look good. Back in a moment with more of The Andrew Lawton Show. Stay tuned.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Speaking of the things that matter, National Post, is it okay to get hairy in COVID-19 lockdown? This is a letter from, not from someone who's mentioning their name. The name is just Harry and just don't care. The question is, I noticed that guys everywhere are letting their facial hair grow. I get it. Why would you take the time to shave every day when you aren't going anywhere? As a woman, I have to admit, I have also let things slide in the personal upkeep area. Let's just say that the lady down at the waxing place, the one with the window sign that says stop shaving your beaver, is going to have her work cut out for her when all of this COVID-19 stuff settles. The advice is that time spent at home during self-isolation is no exception to the rule that we sometimes feel bored and uninspired. The writer of the response says, "You seem like you were pretty laid back about the whole thing. Sporting a jungle is no small thing. But at the same time, if you get in shape and then quit, over time your muscles will get weaker, as will your body. So you apparently are supposed to keep up your personal hygiene." So the National Post says it is not okay to get hairy in lockdown or something like that. I lost track when the story just kept going on, and it actually went on longer than Justin Trudeau's lockdown did. This is apparently what people are caring about now. So it's funny because on one hand I was saying we need to care about more important things, and then the next tab that I open on my computer is about personal grooming. I'm actually in a very beneficial position right now because I have to wear a nice shirt when I go on camera. And like I said last week, I mean, you never know if I'm wearing like track pants or pajama pants underneath, but from the stomach up, I look very presentable. So that forces me to not go around as completely slovenly as some other people might be. It's not because I'm naturally a put-together person, I assure you. It's just because if I just sit down here with some like hooded sweatshirt, having not shaved in a week, you'll think, wow, why is that homeless guy doing a show, and why should we listen to him? So in any case, let's talk a little bit about the global aspect of COVID-19, because even still, China is not trustworthy. China lied, people died. If you remember nothing else from the show, remember those 4 words. And there is a letter from parliamentarians from all over the world, from the UK, from Australia, from Estonia, calling on China to be held accountable. And this is something that in the letter they call China's Chernobyl moment. 100 politicians and policy experts have signed, including former Canadian Attorney General Irwin Cotler, who is he's a liberal. I disagree with him on a lot, but I agree with him on a great deal as well. He's from a vintage of liberal that just doesn't exist anymore. But the problem is not a single current Canadian legislator has signed this letter, not one. The letter's important. China's Chernobyl moment is a self-inflicted wound. The Chinese Communist Party silenced Chinese doctors who wanted to warn other health professionals during the early stage of the outbreak, it says. It criticizes the World Health Organization. It criticizes the capitulation of Chinese pressure to downplay. It does all of this stuff. It does all of it. And you know what? Not a single Canadian MP would put their name to this. Now, there are a number that I know probably would endorse the spirit of it. But the fact that no one from the Liberal government, no one from the Trudeau government is prepared to accept this is a big problem. I mean, we talked for a couple of shows about Patty Haidu, Politburo Patty's capitulation of the Chinese by saying there's no indication the numbers can't be trusted. Other countries as well. I mean, the World Health Organization is right now merely an extension of China. The WHO has completely adopted the Chinese talking points and itself was early on saying, there's no evidence of human-to-human transmission. There's no real risk. This is contained and this is downplayed. So at a time when the WHO could have and should have been looking to other countries and saying, hey, just so you know, guys, gird your loins because this thing's coming out of China and you won't be able to stop it easily. Instead, the WHO was doing what China was trying to do, which is telling people, you don't need to worry. It's all okay. Everything's fine. We're managing it. It's barely an inconvenience. It's just a little contained sort of thing there. Easy to maintain. And what happens? What happens? Well, you look around you. This is what happens. The world since then is what happens. And I know that everyone in the U.S. right now is losing their mind, everyone on the left actually around the world, that Donald Trump is pulling funding from the WHO, halting U.S. funding. Let's talk about this because I think Canada would be completely justified in following suit. I think that people have a very distorted view of what the World Health Organization does. It is not a public health agency in the sense that it's not actually doing anything to promote or foster public health. The World Health Organization is an aggregator of data at best, but it's not even particularly good data. I mean, it seems like its greatest contribution to the COVID-19 effort is a spreadsheet that they just populate with numbers that other countries send in. So when, Xi Jinping says, China has, 200 deaths and that's it, everything's fine, WHO just goes, okay, we got 200 deaths, all right. And then when Iran says, oh yeah, we've just got, a couple here and there, they, okay, Iran, just a couple. Like, that's all they do. So when you have a case like Ebola, when you have viruses or infections or bacterial issues that are in parts of the world that don't have the response in a box like Western governments do, yeah, the WHO has been, I think, important. I mean, the WHO did very well with Ebola. But when you have countries like the US, UK, Australia, Canada, the European Union is not a country, but you know what I mean. When they're impacted by this, they have public health apparati that do as much as the World Health Organization could do and more. And they're able to manage these things. Because right now, the World Health Organization is not leading a global effort. I mean, they're sitting on the sidelines and just telling people what China tells them to say. And this is there's no credibility whatsoever. And this is one of the reasons that I think Dr. Theresa Tam warrants some skepticism from Canadians, because more than other public health officials, she is herself linked to the WHO. She's got a number of WHO positions. She's worked on a number of WHO projects, and I think that her link to the WHO is something that itself might color the stuff she said that just ended up being wrong going back to January, using WHO and by extension using Chinese talking points. And it was actually good to see Jason Kenney, the Premier of Alberta, criticize her for this when answering a question from Vashi Kapelos on CBC about why Alberta wants to circumvent Health Canada approvals. And I don't blame it. I mean, Health Canada has been behind the curve for the entirety of this crisis. They're still behind the curve. You've got vaccines, tests, and drugs that other countries have tested and allowed and approved that Canada still hasn't, because Canada's like, oh, we've got a rigorous process and all of this stuff. And Jason Kenney said, listen, if a country that we trust or a jurisdiction we trust, like the FDA, the Australian Health Agency, the European Union Health Agency, if they've gone through the due diligence here and approved these things, why should we not? So what he says is Alberta is going to completely allow these things from what he calls peer countries. But I'm glad that he took aim at PHAC, at the Public Health Agency of Canada, when pushed back on by this. Hey, take a look at this exchange.
And you tweeted yesterday that you're directing health officials to use or to consider using testing methods that are approved by regulators in other countries, not specifically by Health Canada. Does that mean that you don't trust Health Canada?
No, of course I trust them as their credibility as a agency in terms of their approvals, but we're not going to wait for Health Canada to play catch-up with, for example, the European Union's drug regulator or the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. The direction I've given our officials is that if we see a highly credible regulator of medications in a peer jurisdiction like the European Union, Australia, or the United States that has approved a test or a vaccine or medication, we should pursue that. We should not wait for Health Canada to catch up. So we're not going to allow, I think one of the critical learnings about response to pandemic is you do not allow bureaucracy to get in the way of speed of response. And that's one of the reasons that Alberta is participating, for example, in trials for hydroxychloroquine, which is a potential medical treatment.
But with respect, Premier, it's not exactly just about bureaucracy, right? Health Canada performs a function in which they vet these tests. And Dr. Tam today, in response to your tweet, said that they do have significant concerns about the quality of some of those tests. So if you instead defer to speed and you end up with tests that aren't accurate, that becomes a health risk in and of itself, does it not?
Is Dr. Tam suggesting that That the European Union's regulator of medications or the Food and Drug Administration approve things that are dangerous for public use. This is the same Dr. Tam who is telling us that we shouldn't close our borders to countries with high levels of infection, and who in January was repeating talking points out of the PRC about no evidence of human-to-human transmission.
Yeah, I mean, he's not wrong. There were Chinese talking points that were being parroted by Canadian officials. Now, it's not to say that they're Chinese operatives, but either way, they were either uncritical of China, which makes them bad at their jobs, or they just didn't think it was worthwhile to criticize China, in which case they're still not particularly good at their jobs. No matter what the reason was, the result is the same, which is data that can't be trusted coming from the people who are telling us, just trust us, because they know best. And the people that Justin Trudeau has effectively given a blank slate to and a blank check to put whatever policy measures they want to in place in Canada. And when what they're saying is indistinguishable from what China's saying, yeah, I think it's time for Canadians to look abroad. So good on Donald Trump for pulling WHO funding. It'll be interesting to see if a similar push comes from the Conservatives or even Conservative leadership candidates, who I know are not supposed to be campaigning but are anyway. Because right now, the U.S. has to pay for every country's share of the UN, of NATO, of WHO, of all of these international bodies, and the U.S. gets very little out of it. I mean, the U.S. just gets completely crapped on by the UN, but most of its budget is coming from the U.S., and its entire domicile is at the U.S., and the WHO is headquartered abroad, but it's the same sort of thing. Why should the United States have to bankroll this thing that is not doing anything, and by the way, hasn't really contributed much of a net positive in the coronavirus combat effort? And that, I think, is where we need to have a real discussion about this moving forward. Now, I said last week, maybe it doesn't need to be done right now. Maybe you can just review the WHO relationship after the crisis. But now that we hear, okay, this crisis is going to go on, up to 2 years, there might not be an after. So if the problem is there now and they need an about face, this may be the thing that triggers it. Although, of course, all of the so-called experts in the U.S. are now saying, oh, no, but you can't do it, we can't do it. I think that no one can force a country to hand a check over to an international body that ultimately has no jurisdiction. So take that for what it's worth. We've got to take a break. When we come back, a final wrap-up of the Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. Stay tuned.
You're tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
I'm ending on a bit of a boring subject here, but I do think it's an important one, so please bear with me. And that is the lack of coverage of the government's relief measures for people impacted by COVID-19. And I'm speaking specifically of employers and business owners and entrepreneurs here, because right now the government has made $2,000 a month available to people who are out of work or people who have no income because of COVID-19, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. And by all accounts, very easy to apply for. You just go on, and a few days later, $2,000 appears in your bank account, or you get a check, whichever you have signed up on for Canada Revenue Agency. But when you look through all of the things for employers, it's a lot different, and there are huge gaps in it. So the big employer measures are deferral of tax payments and deferral of GST, HST remittance, which is fine. But as far as the cash payments that deal with loss of revenue, there's the wage subsidy, which will cover up to 75% of employee wages for a term of time. I think it's 3 months. There is the Canada Emergency Business Account, CEBA, which is a government-guaranteed loan from your bank of up to $40,000, interest-free, and $30,000 is all you have to pay back. And then there are some other measures as well that are available, like loans through BDC and some other things. But for the most part, these are the primary programs. Now, if you are self-employed and you have some income, you are ineligible. You are completely ineligible. The government has tried to make it now so that if you work less than 10 hours a week, you can still apply for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. But for the most part, if you're self-employed and you lose, let's say, 80% of your livelihood, it is more advantageous for you to stop working entirely and claim the $2,000 than it is for you to keep working and thus be ineligible for it. And I thought, because I'm self-employed, and I know I do a lot of stuff for True North, and this is not really relevant to most of you throughout the year, but I'm telling you just because it's relevant to the story I'm telling right now. On paper, I am self-employed and I am a contractor, and that is the way I set it up because I do other things as well. I have a very exciting life. I really don't. But anyway, I'm self-employed, and I'm actually okay. So I'm not saying this because I'm trying to say that I'm in a rough spot, because I'm not, but I know people who are. And I have a lot of friends of mine who are employers that have had to shut down and have no real mechanism of support available. And someone I did talk about on a previous episode that I know who owns a restaurant, and they have to shut down. They aren't paying their employees, so the wage subsidy doesn't really do anything for them. They can benefit from the loan, but it doesn't really deal with the revenue side of things. If you are a sole proprietor, you're not someone who has a corporation, you're a sole proprietor, you can't benefit from that emergency loan at all. The only thing you could get if you're a sole proprietor is that $2,000 a month. But if you're a sole proprietor who's still doing a bit of work, you are completely excluded from the personal support measures, and you are completely excluded from the business support measures, meaning you are left in between. And I found a stat on this that was interesting, which is that the vast majority of small businesses have between 1 and 4 employees. So for you to have access to that government-backed loan, you have, and I think this is fascinating, you have to have payroll between $50,000 and $1 million. A lot of small businesses, certainly sole proprietorships, don't have that. And if you're a sole proprietor who pays yourself, but you take it as business revenue rather than payroll, which is how most people do it, you're excluded from this. Now, for a lot of people listening or watching, I know this may sound Greek to you, and I don't expect you to become experts in this stuff. I'm certainly not an expert in it. I'm just someone who's tried to navigate this system and figure out what's available for who and how easy it is to access. But the reason I share this with you is to say that there are huge swaths of the population that are ineligible for the government support, or for whom the government support is not all that adequate. And it would be so easy for the government to expand eligibility. And the more that I see this all, the more strengthened I am in my resolve that it would be better for the government to just say, you know what? Everyone who wants it gets the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. And if your income for 2020 is over a certain amount, and I don't know what you make that amount, we'll take it back from you at tax time. That would solve pretty much all of the problems. Well, no, let me clarify. It wouldn't solve all the problems. It would solve the eligibility problems with the current programs. It wouldn't solve cash flow issues for businesses. It wouldn't solve that. But it would at least make it so there aren't people that are completely excluded from all programs, which is the issue now. And this goes beyond partisanship. This is something that I would criticize because it's not a liberal or conservative issue. It's something that just, if the government is going to commit to this path, do it a lot better. And this is why I've been really holding up the importance of the official opposition in this, because the official opposition is the only real way to tell the government, hey, we think you should do this, and then put it in legislation. Look, I'm not able to ask questions of Justin Trudeau at those press conferences. I'm still banned from covering the Justin Trudeau government, and that's something I have to live with right now. But I would love to see these ideas put forward. So if you have an MP, especially a Liberal MP, talk to them about this. Talk to them about this. Say, listen, there are people I know of who are excluded from all of these programs. Ask them about sole proprietors. Ask them about employers in businesses that don't have any cash flow right now, so wage subsidy is not the issue. Ask them about these people, because there needs to be some pressure on the government to expand the criteria so that those who most need the supports that are being offered right now are able to access it. So that's my little TED Talk that I'll end with today. My thanks to all of you for tuning into the show, writing in. We might do a reader email or listener email episode in the future, because I've gotten some great thoughts and some very heartwarming thoughts from people, but that'll have to wait. In the meantime, thank you, God bless, and good day, Canada.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.